Hello, this is Terry from Generically Yours, or you may know me as Sublime Sorrows on Twitter, or Sublime Sorrow on Instagram, or Terry L on YouNow. Today I'm going to cover how I made this Social Repose splatter art. The first thing I did was paint the splatter painting for the background. Doing this meant a lot of flicking and tapping, and continuous wiping off the table because I didn't think to put down any sort of plastic or paper. If you ever decide to try to do a splatter painting on your own, and I'll be covering how to do this in a future video, keep in mind that it really is messy, so you will definitely want to have a lot of space and some sort of something to cover your work area, and maybe some gloves. Unless you like your hands looking like you had a fight with a paint can. Ah yes, words of wisdom brought to you by perfect 2020 hindsight. But anyway, after I cleaned my mess, for the 100th time, I freehanded an outline of Social Repose's silhouette that I could use as a template for the layered paper part of the art piece. Layered paper has got to be my absolute favorite of all the different art styles I've tackled. I love how it looks, all the different layers and the texture of it, also how much detail you can get into that frickin' thing if you have the time and the patience for it. Some of you may recognize my other layered paper artwork from one of Richie's unboxing videos. But back to the silhouette. As you can see, if you look closely, that I had toyed with the idea of including his hawk wings, but I looked at the splatter background again and the area I had made for him, and I realized that if I did include his wings, it would look really cramped, so I decided not to. The next step was to trace the template I made onto black paper. I actually gave a little bit of leeway when I traced around it so it was slightly larger than the original. I cut it out and I painted a thin wash of metallic purple paint over the edges. This is the base layer everything else was going to be glued onto, and the outer aura for the silhouette. Then, using the original template again, I traced it again on black paper. This time I traced it closely and added in the tatters at the bottom of his robe thing. This one was the one that would have the extra details and layers glued onto it. This project I wanted to be more simple than my other layered paper pieces, so I tried to keep that in mind as I decided which details I wanted to include. His entire outfit is actually quite detailed and complex in real life, with a lot of textures and layers, so I chose to dial it back just a little bit to his face paint and his rather infamous and iconic headdress. To start the process of building up the layers I wanted, I glued the top silhouette to the aura layer. Next came the more intricate parts, starting with his face. So going back to the original template, I cut out his face from it so I could use it as a separate one to trace. I would like to point out right here that if you are ever thinking of trying layered paper art, especially how I do it by using just one template and slowly cutting it up to use for other layers, it's very important that you think it out and plan how to use it, starting by the biggest and working to smallest, because there's no going back once you start hacking it up. So think in layers. What's the biggest bottom layer? What's going to be the next layer? And the layer after that? After cutting out the face, I cut out the crown. And for most of these tiny parts, I had to rely on a box cutter because my scissors were just too freaking big. Once I cut out the crown, I painted a splotch of dark purple on a bit of paper and traced the outline on top of it, and after it dried, using a tiny brush, I painted on the smaller details. Once all of it dried, I cut it out. On one of the scraps of black paper that I had, I mixed up a few different shades of purple, silver, and gray, and painted splotches of each color. This was going to be the individual feathers for his headdress. And keeping with the theme of simplicity, I had decided to only do the feathers that come off from his crown. I felt like it would stand out more that way, and not make so many feathers that they would just kind of blend together. Again, I used the original to help me kind of guide the shape and number of feathers that I was going to need. I more or less free-handed the shape and length of the feathers onto the color splotches in pencil, and then cut them out and trimmed them as I needed. I glued them together, layering them in a fan-like way. Here you can see the white face is already in place. I painted on two little black dots for his face paint. I decided for this art piece to not paint his eyes because I felt like it would distract from the emphasis of his face paint. I really wanted that to be able to stand out because it is very iconic, his face paint and his headdress. You can also see the finished crown and the feathers for his headdress. Off to the side there, you can see the poor hacked up template. The poor little thing didn't stand a chance. From here, I glued down the feathers first because, thinking in layers, the feathers are below the crown, so therefore they go on first and then the crown gets glued on top of them. After everything was glued in place, I went back with my tiny brush and some white paint to define a couple details like the tattered bottom of his robe thingy, his legs, and his shoes, and the little feather poof that hangs from his headdress. Once the entire silhouette was dry, I positioned it in place and with glue made my work final. This is the finished work again. This took me about, maybe a day to complete, and I've never done anything like this before. The splatter art was an entirely new experience. I had to figure out how to do that as I went. But I'm really glad that I took the chance because it turned out really well. Thank you for watching.